The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Trade.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to rise in this House tonight to speak on Bill C-584, which is a bill before this House that has tapped a number of themes that keep surfacing from time to time from the opposition members that really shows a profound lack of understanding of both the extractive industry, both here in Canada and globally, Mr. Speaker. It should not be surprising coming from a party that is essentially opposed to the private sector and job creation. But I'm going to use my time before the House to talk about what Canada is doing in terms of corporate social responsibility and to point out a few of the fallacies in the ideas behind the all-magical ombudsman with a magic wand that many members of the NDP seem to think will eradicate problems that really have not been shown to even be rooted in operations from Canadian companies around the world, Mr. Speaker. But I'll begin by saying several years ago, in 2009, our government announced an ambitious program on corporate social responsibility. And this came as a result of industry, NGO feedback on the topic, talking about operations around the world for companies generally, but in specifics to the extractive industry, mining, oil and gas, and in many cases, Canada has leading operators. We're also in Toronto, Mr. Speaker, the global centre for mining finance. So Canada, in many ways, has a tremendous and robust and diverse economy, but we're not world leaders in a lot of things. But our capital markets in Toronto, Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to say, has a long history for being the centerpiece of financing for such operations, and do so in a way that's transparent and accountable to investors here in our markets. But the strategy the government embarked upon was based on 4 pillars, Mr. Speaker, in terms of Canadian operators working internationally. The CSR strategy, first pillar is capacity building within countries internationally. Capacity building to make sure that there is not just the investment of a mine or an operation, but there's capacity built around the economic activity generated by an investment in that country. And we have to remember, Mr. Speaker, in some of these countries, witnesses have told us at committee and in my consultations that you've got massive unemployment, big disparity in terms of wealth, and some of these employers end up being some of the largest investors and employers in the country. And we heard, as part of my outreach on the corporate social responsibility program the government has, from groups like Engineers Without Borders, that capacity building in terms of a local supplier or local procurement network in that country can actually have a multiplying effect. So it's not just the mine, it's not just the exploration efforts, but there are people in the country being employed in the supply, the logistics, the transport, the geoengineering going that's involved in these projects. And that capacity building piece is the first pillar. The second is promoting international corporate social responsibility guidelines. And there are many of these guidelines in operation right now, Mr. Speaker, that many corporations in Canada and abroad use to try and bring best practices to their own operations. There's World Bank guidelines. In Canada, the Prospectors and Developers Association of Canada have published their guidelines that are amongst some of the most ambitious out there that they try and encourage their members to follow. The third pillar of our strategy, Mr. Speaker, has been the creation of the Corporate Social Responsibility Councillor. And I'll speak a little bit more about her work, the first councillor we had, Dr. Marquita Evans, in a moment. But that councillor role was not only to help educate and review practices that industry was adopting with respect to corporate social responsibility, but it had an important function of conflict resolution through dialogue, Mr. Speaker. And if time permits today, I'll try and show the honourable colleague who brought this bill forward how that goal is far more attainable and actually far more pragmatic than the suggestions in her bill before the House today. Conflict resolution through dialogue can be the goal of the CSR counselor. And finally, the fourth pillar was to try and build a centre of excellence here in Canada around corporate social responsibility, because that plays well on our strengths that I already referred to, Mr. Speaker. Canada as a centre of excellence in terms of the financial capital markets for mining and the extractive industries, and some of our Canadian players that are also large employers in our economy. So I had the distinct pleasure of reaching out in our review, our 5-year review of the corporate social responsibility platform our government embarked upon in 2009. And that review I did in my role as Parliamentary Secretary for International Trade involved direct consultations. And so I had direct consultations with civil society organizations and NGOs, direct consultations with industry players and industry associations, and as well, Mr. Speaker, in consultations with Dr. Marquita Evans, the corporate social responsibility, or the CSR counselor, who is no longer in the role, but helped open the office through her work. And I'd like to thank Dr. Evans for her work. She had 100+ engagement sessions with industry on CSR practices and their operations globally, bringing up that pillar, the second pillar I referred to earlier, that international CSR performance guidelines, bringing that approach to industry. Beyond that, Dr. Evans also tried to bring some of the best practices she had from her experience in the NGO world prior to becoming the CSR counselor. She followed directly, in many cases, the World Bank policies with respect to corporate social responsibility and practices worldwide. And it was interesting, in the consultations I had with civil society groups, they saw that there was potential with a lot of the elements of CSR programs that some players in industries are doing that have great potential. The biggest I found in my consultations was this capacity building piece, our first pillar, where the investment of a Canadian company into another country, particularly a country that may be a developing country, is the opportunity for this local procurement and supply network. And what groups like Engineers Without Borders and others found was that not only played a multiplier effect, meaning more jobs for men and women on the ground in these countries with huge unemployment, but over time, if the investment of development or exploration or a mine ended, in a lot of cases that peripheral work and that local supply network could lead to a vibrant local economy. We also heard from some of the NGOs like World Vision that have worked on some of our approaches, trying to bring together industry, trying to bring together D-FAIT-D, international development of our foreign affairs, and an NGO actor on the ground in these countries. Why that's important, Mr. Speaker, somebody in Ottawa, be they a senior civil servant or an ombudsman, is not on the ground in these countries, but in a lot of cases the NGOs are. The NGOs in some cases, like World Vision, have decades of experience operating on the ground. If we can work with their development expertise and have a multiplier from government and a multiplier from industry, why would that not be good, Mr. Speaker? And I'd suggest in my final time here that the member, when she introduced this on June 3rd, said, quote her, "We're not talking about the Smurfs here. We're talking about people whose rights are being violated, who are being displaced without their consent." Certainly there's a lot of concern about crime, displacement, and troubles in a lot of these countries. But this is a serious issue, Mr. Speaker, and our CSR policies are serious approaches. The final thing I'd add is an ombudsman that she's proposing in this bill, she said would have real powers to investigate. Someone in Ottawa does not have investigative powers in a foreign country. And it never would, Mr. Speaker. So our 4-pillar plan is a prudent approach, and I'd ask the opposition to support it.
Here.